Eridu is where kingship first descended. That is not fringe literature. It is the opening claim of the Sumerian king list, preserved in cuneiform and published by Thorkild Jacobsen through the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. When kingship was lowered from heaven, it was in Eridu. The same city, Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq, was the cult center of Enki, later Ea, the god of craft, intelligence, subterranean waters, technical skill, and in more than one text, the making of humankind itself. When people say the Anunnaki are fantasy, they are collapsing several different conversations into one. The Anunnaki are real in the narrow historical sense that they exist in Mesopotamian texts, temple liturgies, lexical lists, and myths copied for centuries by trained scribes. But what is not settled is what to do when those texts converge on one place, one god, and one unusually neglected archaeological landscape. I kept returning to that. I still do. The mainstream foundations here are solid. Eridu was excavated, in phases, by John George Taylor in 1855, by Reginald Campbell Thompson in 1918, by H.R. Hall in 1919, and then much more seriously by Fuad Safar, Muhammad Ali Mustafa, and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 under the Iraq Department of Antiquities. Their final report, published in 1981, remains the standard archaeological synthesis for the site. The urban nucleus, as later summarized by Marco Ramazzotti and colleagues, was the temple of Enki called E2-Abzu, the House of the Aquifer, or in Akkadian, Bitu-Apsu, the Temple of the Primeval Deep. The texts are equally established. While Oxford's electronic text, Corpus of Sumerian Literature, preserves Enki and Ninmah, in which Enki is described as the one of great wisdom, the fashioner of designs by himself, the god called upon to create a substitute for the gods so they can be freed from toil. The Old Babylonian Atrahasis epic, translated by scholars from Lambert and Millard to Stephanie Daly, states it even more starkly: Nintu shall mix clay with the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god, and a god and a man will be mixed together in clay. These are not internet inventions. They are classroom texts. They are museum texts. They are catalogued, edited, footnoted, argued over, and taught. As I discussed before in a previous piece on flood traditions, the serious material is often stranger than the popular retellings. The difficulty is not absence of data, and it is what we choose not to do with it. And this is where the terrain changes. Because if Eridu is the city where kingship first descended, if it is the city of Enki's Abzu, if Enki is repeatedly associated with technical wisdom, design, and the making of humans, then the obvious next question is archaeological rather than mythological. What exactly was happening at this site across its deepest levels that caused later Mesopotamian memory to treat it not merely as old but as origin itself? I am not asking whether gods literally came down in machines. I am asking something narrower, and in some ways harder. Why did Mesopotamian tradition place the first transfer of order, authority, and design at this place? And why does the physical investigation of that place remain so thin compared with the cultural weight assigned to it by the civilization that remembered it? One fact matters more than people let it matter. The major excavation seasons at Eridu were carried out from 1946 to 1949. I want to stay with that for a moment. Not because it proves anything by itself. It does not. Sites fall quiet for many reasons. Wars happen, funding disappears, water tables rise, permits stall, whole disciplines drift towards safer questions. But Eridu is not an ordinary site that happened to be left alone. It is the place later Mesopotamian tradition called the First City, the city of Enki, the city where kingship arrived, the city attached to the Abzu, the deep, the beneath the surface. And the modern world largely formed its view of that place from work concentrated into a few brief campaigns in the mid-20th century, after earlier visits that were measured not in years, but in weeks. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Archaeologists are cautious with texts because texts are late, layered, ideological, and often symbolic. A myth about Enki creating humans does not mean a temple was a laboratory in any modern sense. Agreed, entirely agreed. But that explanation only tells me why we should not leap. It does not tell me why we stopped looking. It does not explain why a site carrying this much civilizational memory could remain so under-examined for so long, or why discussions of Eridu are so often satisfied once the word temple appears, and as though calling something a temple ends the question instead of opening it. Before moving forward, this deserves attention. The anomaly is not that scholars deny the texts. The anomaly is that the text and the site are both acknowledged, and then almost never pressed against each other with any sustained curiosity. Start with the texts. In Enki and Ninmah, Enki is not simply wise in the vague devotional sense. He is a planner, a designer. The Oxford translation calls him the fashioner of designs by himself, and the problem he solves is practical. The gods are overworked. A substitute workforce must be made. In Atrahasis, the language becomes procedural. Purification is scheduled for the 1st, 7th and 15th day of the month. One god is slaughtered, flesh and blood are mixed with clay, 14 pieces are pinched off. 7 males and 7 females are formed. A reed is used to cut the umbilical cord. This is myth, yes, but it is myth written in the grammar of process. Why? Then there is Enki and the world order, where Enki boasts that he brought the arts and crafts from the Ikur to his Abzu in Eridu. Not blessings in the abstract. Arts and crafts, technical capacities, ordered competencies, the Sumerian me, the powers or norms of civilization, are repeatedly associated with management, distribution and guarded possession. Inanna has to acquire them, Enki stores them. His city is not merely holy, it is administrative and generative at once. What kind of sacred centre is imagined in that way? Now I want to slow down. In the British Museum, room 56, there is a fired clay figurine from southern Mesopotamia, Museum number 1, 22873, a registration 1930-1213.173, excavated by Leonard Woolley at Ur from a pre-flood level and dated to the Ubaid period, roughly 5900 to 4000 BC. It stands 13.8 centimeters high. The woman's head is missing. The body is narrow, upright, handmade, painted in black with collar markings, dots, bands and a girdle. On her left hip she holds a child. The child's head is explicitly described by the museum as reptilian-like. The adult figure too belongs to a class of elongated, non-naturalistic Ubaid figurines found across southern Mesopotamia, including Eridu. It is the posture that catches me, not enthroned, not worshipping, not fighting, but nursing or presenting itself as nursing, with this small, strange infant held against the body as if the act were ordinary. Look at this if you can, because no description prepares you. It is not large. It does not need to be. What was this for? I want to sit with that before moving on. And because I do not want anyone to think this entire unease rests on a single theatrical museum piece, look at the smaller companion from Eridu itself. The British Museum lists object 115357, registration 1919-1011-3942, excavated by H.R. Hall at Abu Shahrain, ancient Eridu. It is only 4.8 centimeters high and 3.3 centimeters wide, fired clay, broken at the waist, both arms gone, one shoulder surviving. The museum description is painfully dry. Female figurine, reptilian face, elongated head, long oval eyes, applied strips of clay for a headdress. Not on display. That last detail lingers with me. One of the strangest things from Eridu's own archaeological record is not even something most visitors will ever pass in a case. It survives in the database, hid in measurements, in an accession number, in a brief description that sounds almost embarrassed by its own plainness. What social or ritual vocabulary made this image intelligible where it was found? Another piece of evidence is the architecture itself. Eridu's mound preserves a long sequence of superimposed temples, one built over another, reaching back into the Ubaid period. Archaeologists did not find one shrine and a neat story. They found repeated rebuilding at the same sacred point, a continuity of place so persistent that later memory could plausibly attach cosmic firstness to it. Continuity does not prove extraordinary function, but it does tell us that something at that location was being stabilized, renewed, and ritually protected over a very long duration. Why that point? Then there is the language of descent. The Sumerian king list does not say kingship gradually emerged at Eridu after a long social process, though of course that is how archaeologists would model state formation. The text says kingship was lowered from heaven and was in Eridu. It is formulaic, ideological, probably retroactive. I know that. But formulae survive because they carry memory in compressed form. When a civilization repeatedly describes order, craft, authority, and even human manufacture as things transferred downward into bounded institutions, I think we should notice the spatial imagination involved. From where to where, and then there is the simple material problem of access to the record. Cuneiform scholars have said for years that enormous numbers of tablets remain unpublished or insufficiently studied in museums and depots. Ed Irving Finkel has spoken of hundreds of thousands of tablets and collections and millions still in the ground. The archaeology of Mesopotamia is not a closed archive. It is a partially processed one. So when someone tells me the matter is settled, I ask a modest question. Settled on the basis of all the evidence, or only the evidence we have had time to sort? As I discussed before in a previous piece on the First Temple economies, the danger is not always exaggeration. Sometimes it is administrative fatigue. We normalize the gaps, pull back from Mesopotamia, and the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as local symbolism. In Egypt, at Esna, a major temple tradition presents the ram-headed creator Khnum as the god who forms beings materially on a potter's wheel. The UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology summarizes the inscriptions directly. Khnum, it with his own hands, forms all beings and objects materially on the potter's wheel. The temple even preserved a festival of installing the potter's wheel, in which an actual wheel was carried into the sanctuary as a gift to the god, after which the god was understood to commence moulding humans, animals, plants, or creation. This is not a loose resemblance to Mesopotamian clay creation. It is the same structural logic. A creator associated with a specific cult center, a bounded sacred workspace, technical formation rather than simple command, and the making of living beings through shaped matter. Why does creation keep looking like skilled manufacture? Go west, much farther than any simple chain of influence can comfortably carry us, to the Quiche Maya Popol Vuh. In Alan Christensen's translation, the makers and modelers attempt humanity repeatedly. First mud, it fails because the body collapses and dissolves. Then wood. It fails because the beings do not speak or think correctly before their makers. Finally, maize dough becomes the flesh of successful humans. The language is explicit. Framer and shaper. Framing, shaping, human design, not merely birth. Construction through iterative trial. This is not the same theology as Enki or Khnum. I am not claiming that. But structurally it is unnervingly close. Privileged maker beings, multiple attempts, material composition, and humanity as the result of a controlled fabrication sequence rather than a single effortless utterance. Why does that logic recur? Go again, this time to Greece, that where the mythographer Apollodorus states in plain prose that Prometheus moulded men out of water and earth and gave them fire. Fire is not incidental here. It is the transfer of a technical force, a dangerous competence once stolen or mediated from a higher order and then placed in human hands. The combination matters. Fashioned humans, then gifted technology. Form first, capacity second. Even in later classical retellings, Prometheus is less a fertility figure than a figure of craft, forethought, and illicit transmission. Why do origin stories keep attaching humanity to manufacture and then to acquired technique? And if that still feels too Mediterranean, go to early Chinese myth, where Nuwa fashions human beings from yellow clay, shaping some individually by hand before, in later versions, using a cord to speed the work. And here again the pattern is not generic motherhood, it is modelled matter. Handcrafted bodies, a maker responding to scale, process and method. What ties these examples together even more tightly is the institutional setting around them. Eridu has the Abzu temple. Esna has a sanctuary in which the potter's wheel is not metaphor but ritual equipment carried into the god's space. The Popol Vuh survives from a scribal tradition that preserves the titles framer and shaper as technical identities, not casual poetic flourishes. Greece attaches Prometheus to fire as transmissible craft, and craft in Greek culture is never separable from workshop knowledge. In every case, the origin of humanity sits uncomfortably close to the origin of technique. That is the part I find hardest to wave away. If these were only stories about divine parenthood, I would leave them there, but they are not. They are stories about procedure, material, and bounded knowledge. They imagine the beginning not as a spontaneous bloom of life, but as an operation carried out by beings who know how to do something others don't. These are not vague parallels. This is the same vocabulary appearing independently. How does that happen? I do not mean the same names, the same gods, or the same historical event. I mean the same mental architecture. A special place, a maker class or creator being. Matter shaped, not merely summoned. Human life as something assembled, refined, or corrected. The more I sat with that, the less interested I became in arguments over whether one myth copied another. Copying may explain some cases, it does not explain the persistence of the structure. Let's now bring that widened pattern back to Eridu. Eridu is not merely any old city to which later legends attached prestige. It is the place Mesopotamian literature assigns to first kingship, to Enki's Abzu, to the storage and distribution of civilizational powers, and to a god who in one major composition is asked to create substitute humans because the existing order requires labour. The site then yields, from the same broad southern cultural horizon, a corpus of Ubaid figurines whose elongated heads and reptilian features remain difficult to explain in purely naturalistic terms. Archaeologists offer reasonable readings: stylization, ritual identity, perhaps elite representation, perhaps votive imagery, perhaps beings in masks. All of that may be true, yet the recurrence of the type across sites like Eridu and Tel al-Ubaid suggests convention, not whim. What convention? There is another detail here that matters. In many of these traditions, creation is not the only thing concentrated in sacred enclosures. Knowledge is, in Mesopotamia, the mere stored, possessed, transferred. In Egypt, the temple and its attached scribal institutions preserve ritual and technical knowledge. In Mesoamerican priestly contexts, calendrical and cosmological knowledge is likewise concentrated and controlled. The combination of fabrication and guarded knowledge keeps returning together, which I have covered in a previous piece on restricted archives, and the pattern never becomes less unsettling with repetition. Before moving forward, this deserves attention. The claim is not that all these cultures remembered one hidden machine. The claim is that they repeatedly imagined origins through the same framework of controlled production, material shaping, and institutionally guarded knowledge. Eridu is the Mesopotamian node where that framework is anchored to an actual site whose deep archaeology remains frustratingly incomplete. There are legitimate reasons for that incompleteness, and I want to be fair about them. Southern Iraq has lived through the Iran-Iraq War, the 1991 Gulf War, sanctions in the 1990s, the 2003 invasion, mass looting of sites and museums, and the long aftershocks of insurgency and state fragility. Archaeology does not happen in abstraction from that. Foreign missions leave when security collapses. Iraqi archaeologists work with constrained budgets, damaged infrastructure, and bureaucratic burdens most viewers never see. Water, salt, and conservation risk and local logistics are real. So is the fact that archaeology is expensive, slow, and often destructive. One careful trench can be more responsible than a spectacular campaign. But those reasons, real as they are, still do not close the question. From the end of the 1949 seasons to the signing of a new excavation permit in 2014, 65 years passed. That number matters. Not because nobody visited the site in the interim, but because Ramazzotti could still write, in effect, that for more than 50 years, Eridu had not been systematically investigated and excavated. This is not a minor mound. This is the city at the opening of the king list. This is the cult centre of Enki. This is one of the places on Earth where urban religion, political memory, and creation literature overlap most densely. And for decades the discipline largely accepted an inherited picture. The excavation history makes the point almost brutally. Taylor worked there for roughly 2 weeks in 1855. Campbell Thompson's season in 1918 lasted about 3 weeks. Hall's 1919 work was brief. Then came the important Iraqi campaigns of 1946 through 1949, after which the site again slipped into long quiet. When I line those durations up, I do not see a robust cumulative assault on the deepest questions of Eridu. I see flashes, short contacts, a discipline touching the site, withdrawing then returning only intermittently. For a place later memory treated as a point of descent, the modern record feels strangely glancing. There is also the scale problem. Eridu is not a single neat mound with one exposed building. The broader site comprises 7 mounds over a large area, roughly 25 square kilometres in Ramazzotti's summary. Any archaeologist will tell you that a landscape of that size cannot be exhausted quickly. Fair enough, but that should intensify the case for sustained work, not soften it. The larger and more complex the site, the weaker the argument that a handful of seasons settled its meaning. Even after renewed work became possible, the most visible breakthroughs around Eridu in recent years have often come through landscape survey, remote sensing and canal mapping rather than deep, sustained reopening of the core questions at the mound itself. Those methods are valuable. They revealed a vast irrigation network in the Eridu region. They help reconstruct settlement and economy. But survey around a place is not the same thing as exhausting the place. The distinction matters. Then there is the publication lag. Archaeology in Mesopotamia still depends on texts, objects, and field records scattered across Baghdad, London, Philadelphia, and Istanbul, Berlin, and elsewhere, with large quantities unpublished. The British Museum alone holds roughly 130,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments. Across collections, the numbers rise into the hundreds of thousands. Some are mundane, of course, receipts, rations, contracts, but that is exactly the point. You do not know what sits in an archive until someone reads it carefully, and reading cuneiform at scale is the work of lifetimes. I am not describing a coordinated suppression. I am describing something more diffuse than that, and in some ways more troubling. That a civilizational blind spot can emerge without a villain. One generation inherits categories from the previous one: temple, myth, ritual, symbolic. Another generation inherits the excavation summaries. Another inherits the assumption that the big interpretive work has already been done. Funding bodies then favour narrower, safer projects. Graduate students choose topics that can be finished. Museums prioritise conservation over radical reinterpretation. Little by little, the most consequential questions are not refuted. They are outweighted. And when an alternative writer steps into that vacuum and says, too confidently, that this was a laboratory of the Anunnaki, academia recoils, understandably. It should recoil from overclaiming. I recoil from it myself. But once the recoil becomes habitual, it starts doing something else. And it begins to treat the existence of bad interpretations as a reason not to pursue the good question underneath them. That, to me, is the deeper failure of curiosity. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying the excavators at Eridu uncovered advanced technology and hid it. I am not claiming the Ubaid figurines are portraits of literal non-human beings. I am not saying Mesopotamian creation texts are eyewitness reports. What I am saying is that mainstream archaeological and philological S-place at Eridu, a uniquely important convergence of First Kingship tradition, Enki's Abzu temple, creation literature grounded in material fabrication, and a site history that remained only intermittently and partially investigated for most of the modern era. That observation should not be controversial. It is drawn from the standard excavation history. The Sumerian king list, Atrahasis, Enki and Ninmah, and the museum record of the southern Mesopotamian figurines. A skeptic can reject every speculative conclusion and still be left with the same uncomfortable core fact. One of the foundational origin points in Mesopotamian memory has not been examined with anything like the persistence its textual importance would seem to warrant. I find that difficult to dismiss, and harder to dismiss each time I return to the primary S. Before I ask the questions that remain, I want to mark the exact shape of the gap. We have myths that read with striking procedural precision. We have a site attached to those myths by name, by cult, and by royal memory. We have artifacts from the same southern horizon whose iconography resists easy domestication. We have an excavation history marked by brilliance, an interruption, and longshorementsance. What we do not have is a finished synthesis robust enough to let any careful person feel the matter is closed. That is where I am landing. Not at certainty, at an evidence field still open. So the record leaves me with questions, and none of them feel ornamental anymore. Why did later Mesopotamian scholarship insist that kingship was lowered from heaven specifically into Eridu and not simply into a generic sacred past? What exactly was housed, enacted, or remembered at the E2-Abzu that made the deep the governing metaphor for Enki's domain? The record does not tell us why procedural, almost technical language saturates the human creation passages in Atrahasis, and I find that absence harder to explain the longer I sit with it. But what social reality lay behind the repeated rebuilding of the same sacred point at Eridu across so many levels? Why do Ubaid figurines from the Eridu horizon present bodies and heads so far from naturalistic proportion? That British Museum mother and child figurine from Ur, from the same southern cultural matrix, what was it meant to show? Why do creation traditions separated by such distances keep describing makers who shape life from matter, inside privileged, knowledge-bomb-bearing institutions? Which memory became myth here? Why did a civilization that could describe irrigation, labour and temple administration in exacting practical terms choose such insistently material language for making humans? What sits behind the phrase House of the Aquifer when attached to a god whose myths revolve around design, craft and intervention? The record does not tell us whether the repeated temple rebuilding at Eridu preserved a memory of continuous right, continuous authority, or something even more basic about the spot itself, and I find that uncertainty heavier than the usual phrase ritual centre can carry. Why are the most unsettling Obeid figurines concentrated in the same southern cultural world that made Eridu the place of first kingship? What did Hall's little Eridu figurine, Object 115357, mean to the people who made it, handled it, and left it behind? Where, in the still unread or unpublished portions of the textual record, are the explanatory links we may simply not have recovered yet? And why does so much of the conversation still proceed as if the responsible position were to stop at symbolism precisely where the symbolism becomes most exact? So we do not know what kind of place this was. Dust sits in the seams of the clay. The painted bands are still visible if you lean close enough. In London, under museum light, the little Ubaid figure stands without the head of the woman who holds the child, and the child's reptilian-like face turns the entire scene away from comfort. It is only 13.8 centimetres high, a small thing, smaller than a hand, yet it carries an atmosphere larger than itself because it asks to be read as domestic and refuses to become fully domestic. A mother and infant should calm the eye, this one does not. Then I think about where the type belongs in the wider map of southern Mesopotamia, among sites like Eridu, Ur, and Tel al-Ubaid, in the long shadow of the Abzu tradition, the creation texts, the descent of kingship, the guarded powers, how the old mound left for decades between serious campaigns. I think about how often the deepest questions are left alone, not because they have been answered, but because every available answer feels too symbolic for one audience and too speculative for the other. And so the object remains where it is, tagged, measured, conserved, and fundamentally unquiet. That is the image I cannot get rid of. Not a spaceship, not a fantasy. A clay body from the Ubaid world made by human hands, recovered by archaeologists, accessioned by a museum, and still carrying the residue of a thought we have not fully reconstructed. We know enough to place it. We do not know enough to settle it. The same is true, I think, of Eridu itself. And the longer I sit with it, the less I think the central issue is whether the old stories were literally true. The issue is that a civilization left us a cluster of signals around one place. Descent, deep water, stored powers, fashioned life, a god of design, a long sacred continuity, and images that remain visually estranged from ordinary human portraiture. We inherited those signals, translated them, catalogued them, argued over them, and then, for long stretches, accepted partial access as if it were resolution. So I end where I began, with an object under light and a site under dust. One is in a museum case. One is still a landscape of mounds in southern Iraq. Both are real. Both are documented. Both continue to generate far more confidence in both believers and skeptics than the evidence actually permits. I want to be honest about where I am landing, not in certainty, in refusal. I do not accept that official silence, institutional caution, and inherited categories amount to an adequate response to Eridu. If a civilization called this place the of design, labour and life, what exactly have we agreed not to excavate?